Okay, well, the first time I was asked to give this talk, I was given the title, Ethical Assumptions of Economics. My first thought was that this was going to be a really short talk. I'd get up, I'd say, well, economics has no ethical assumptions. Then I'd sit down. And they said, no, we're not going to pay you to do that. You've got to talk for a whole hour about this stuff. So, ever since then, I have essentially interpreted this topic to mean something like ethical implications of economics rather than simply ethical assumptions. So, more broadly, how are economics and ethics connected? What are the implications for ethics of accepting, the kind of economic views that we see in the Austrian school? Now, there are a couple of phrases that you often see in Austrian writing. One is subjective value, or value subjectivism. The view that economic value, as Austrians understand it, is subjective. Another term you often see is value freedom, or the idea that economic analysis is value free. Value freedom isn't a new cool kind of freedom. It means not. It's analysis that doesn't presuppose or rely on values. You sometimes see it in its German form, Wertfreiheit, which I have on the handout that I hope is going around back there somewhere. So you might think, well, look, if Austrian economics says that values are subjective, or it's offering an analysis that's value-free, then you might think that it's not going to be very useful for purposes of ethics. If you think it's value-free, you might think it just doesn't have anything to tell you about ethics. And if it says that value is subjective, you might think that it's actually a threat to any theory of ethics. I'm going to say, well, maybe not necessarily. Maybe there are ethical implications and perhaps even objective ethical implications you can get not necessarily directly from Austrian economics, but from some of the foundational thinking in it. But first I want to get out of the way an issue that is sometimes raised, the issue of whether the kind of value freedom we get among economists is maybe pseudo-value freedom. And this is the idea that economists often use terms that are supposed to be somewhat descriptive and evaluatively neutral, but often have some kind of evaluative flavor to them. So, for example, terms like welfare in welfare economics, not welfare in the sense of payment you get from the government, but the thing that they're supposed to promote, welfare, human well-being. And you might think, well, that's a normative concept. To say that something is a component of or an aspect of someone's welfare or people's welfare is to say something positive about it. Or likewise, take a concept like property, where you might think that economists talk about property and think they're being normatively neutral, but you might say, well, property, the natural meaning of property is legitimate property. To say something is someone's property is to say that they have a right to it. Now, I think that this worry is partly right and partly wrong. The way in which it's wrong is, it's perfectly possible to have sort of value-neutral meanings of these terms. For example, you could certainly use the term property in doing economic analysis without necessarily endorsing the property institutions of the society you're talking about. For example, you could talk about the slavery market. You can talk about supply and demand for slaves and so forth. You can talk about how that market operated, and you can talk about it in terms of property without thereby granting that slaves are legitimately the property of their slave owners. So you can certainly use terms like property without yourself endorsing what's being treated as property in a particular system with what is actually legitimate property. And likewise, by welfare, you can mean what a person subjectively perceives as their welfare, which you might or might not think is the right account. So to that extent, I think the worry fails. But I think that there's still something to it in a couple of ways. First of all, I think that economists often slide between using these terms in a value-neutral way and using them in a way that actually implies some kind of endorsement. So people often slide between using, property in some way that is evaluative neutral and using it in such a way as though you're assuming that the property institutions of a particular society are just, or something like that. Perhaps a more philosophically interesting point to notice is that there are a lot of terms in economics that you might think can be pushed in kind of a value or ethical direction, even if the people who are using them don't necessarily intend that. I'll give an example from Socrates. So there are a couple of Socratic dialogues. We're not sure who they're by. They were traditionally included in collections of Plato's works, but it's often thought that they're probably by people perhaps of a generation or two after Plato in the Academy. Although in the case of one of them, I think the standard argument against it, I think, is a bad argument. But nevertheless, I think that there is reason at least to doubt that these are by Plato. But it doesn't matter. I mean, we've got these ancient arguments. Whether they're actually from Plato or Socrates is a separate question. So there's this issue about the nature of profit that comes up in the Hipparchus and in the Eryxias, and likewise similar concepts such as wealth. And what Socrates tries to argue in these dialogues is that it's impossible to have a purely value-neutral conception of profit, he maintains. And so he's debating with someone who tries at one point to offer an evaluatively neutral conception, and says, well, by profit I simply mean getting back more than what you put in. You invest a certain amount, you get back more than what you invested, so profit. Now, from an Austrian analysis that doesn't make some distinctions, you might want to distinguish between profit and interest and so forth. But never mind that for the moment. Socrates' objection is different. Socrates is going to say, well, look, you can't just mean just getting more stuff in terms of physical quantity than what you put in. You're not going to call that a profit. Because after all, if I give you a huge pile of pennies, and in turn you give me back a small pile of bills, then I've given a lot of material stuff. I've only got back a small amount of material stuff, but it might very well be that I still made a profit. Why? Because the small amount of bills I've gotten back may be greater in value than the huge amount of coins that I gave you. I gave you stacks of pennies, and you've just given me a few $1,000 bills. And so Socrates says, well, look, what this shows is nothing counts as a profit unless what you get back in exchange is more valuable than what you gave up. And then Socrates is going to go on to show that what that means then is that only ethical profits are truly profits, because if it's not achieved ethically, then it's not truly valuable. Now, it's obvious enough what someone like Mises is going to say to this, which is, well, wait a second. It's certainly true that it doesn't count as a profit unless it's more valuable to you than what you gave up. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's objectively more valuable. Now, one reason Socrates would disagree with Mises is Socrates would say, look, if you think it's more valuable, then you've genuinely made a profit only if what you think is correct. So, for example, suppose what you want is to own a Rembrandt painting, and suppose instead that you buy a fake, thinking it's real. So you haven't really gotten what you wanted, and so you haven't really made a profit, because just as you can be mistaken about the means to your ends, you can also be mistaken about whether something counts as the end you had in mind. And so Socrates is going to think, if you want something because you think it's valuable, and it's really not objectively valuable, you didn't get what you wanted. So that's sort of getting into ethical territory, and Mises, for reasons we'll get into, we want to resist that move. I want to distinguish between two kinds or two senses of the concept of subjective value. And on the handout I call this explanatory value subjectivism and normative value subjectivism. Explanatory value subjectivism is the idea that in explaining people's actions, you should appeal to the values that they hold, not necessarily to the values that you think are correct. Just as in explaining people's actions, you want to appeal to the beliefs that they hold, and not necessarily to the beliefs that you think are true. If you try to interpret other people's actions, assuming that they have all the same beliefs and values you have, sometimes their actions will be very strange. They'll vote for the wrong people. They'll order the wrong food. they'll order that food that tastes awful. Why do they keep ordering that? And so on. Obviously, if you want to explain people's actions, you have to explain it in terms of the world as they see it. You're not going to explain why they walk over the broken bridge if you're allowed to bring in your knowledge that the bridge is broken, given that they don't know that the bridge is broken and they think they're doing something perfectly safe. Likewise, if you want to explain why they keep ordering the Brussels sprouts, if you think Brussels sprouts taste awful, then it would be puzzling if you kept ordering them. But you're not going to appeal to your values to explain why they are ordering them. So that's a fairly obvious point, although it's not so obvious that people don't, make a mistake about it and violate it. But that's one sense of value subjectivism. In that sense, economics is it goes by subjective value in the sense that you have to explain actions by appealing to the world as the people saw it themselves. You explain why they acted in terms of what they valued, what they believed, and so on. Normative value subjectivism is the view that all values are in effect equally good, or there's nothing to be said in favor of one value more than another when it comes to ultimate ends. You can argue about what means is the most effective way of getting to some end, but there's really nothing to be said for or against any end. Those are different claims. You can hold one without the other. You can believe that you should explain people's actions according to their own subjective values. You don't, in holding that, necessarily have to hold that everyone's values are equally good, or that there's you can't say that objectively some values might have more to say for them than others. Now Mises held both these views. By contrast with, I would say, Rothbard held just the first view. So Mises and Rothbard agree on explanatory value subjectivism. They agree that if you want to explain people's actions, you have to explain them in terms of the values that the acting individuals themselves held. But when it comes to normative value subjectivism, there Rothbard and Mises part company. Rothbard thinks, look, you should explain actions in terms of what the people value, but if you want to evaluate their actions, you also have to consider whether their values are any good or not. And, Rothbard thinks he's got arguments to show that some of these, values are simply mistaken. Whereas Mises thinks, for reasons I'll talk about, that once you grant explanatory value subjectivism, you've got a reason to accept normative value subjectivism as well. Well, to the extent that economics depends on subjective value, how can economists offer any advice? How can you offer advice as what to do if you think that, whatever people want to do is equally good? Well, there are several different ways in which economic theory and praxeology more broadly might be relevant to giving advice. First of all, clearly you can give advice about means, and Mises always stresses this point. Here's the advice, what the economist can do by way of giving advice. The economist, according to Mises, can't tell you what ends you should pursue, because Mises thinks that's subjective. But given certain ends, the economist can tell you whether your means are well-suited or ill-suited to achieve those ends. If you want to get to some place, it's as though the economist can give you, driving directions as to how to get there. And if you want to get from here to the Cambridge dorm, and the advice involves going through Opelika, it's probably not very good advice. So praxeology can tell you, since praxeology is concerned with what sorts of things tend to cause what sorts of things, economics and praxeology can tell you how to achieve your ends, whatever they may be. Now Rothbard goes one step further, although I think in doing this he's implicitly following something that Mises is implicit in Mises, which is Rothbard thinks that pure economics, before you even get into ethics, pure economics can criticize certain ethical positions from a purely praxeological point of view. Now Rothbard thought you can do more than this. Rothbard thought you can give positive ethical arguments. But Rothbard also thinks that there are some cases you can give a purely ethical or praxeological argument against some moral view. Not just by showing that the people who hold this view have chosen inefficient means to their ends, but by showing that their end in some sense is impossible or incoherent or contradictory or doesn't make sense. So in the last chapter of Power and Market, Rothbard spent some time talking about what he calls anti-market ethics, various different ethical positions that are opposed to the free market. And in those passages, the arguments he gives are not intended to be primarily ethical arguments against them. He's got ethical arguments against them elsewhere. I mean, he wrote The Ethics of Liberty, which is sort of his positive ethical case for libertarianism. But in the last chapter of Power and Market, what instead he's doing is giving purely economic arguments. In some cases, the arguments are that the means that these guys have chosen doesn't fit their ends. But in a lot of cases, he's just arguing that the ends themselves don't make sense. If you can show that something can't be achieved, then, in effect, you've shown that it's not rational to aim it as an end. Because the whole point of aiming at something is to get it. And if something can't be gotten, it seems like a bad idea to aim at it. And so, in that sense, economic analysis can criticize ends too. But then there's the broader question of whether praxeology can say anything more that's relevant to establishing ethical conclusions over and above just the kind of thing that Rothbard does in Power and Market. And some of that's what I want to talk about today. Well, I've talked a little bit about a disagreement between Menger between Rothbard and Mises. As I said, I haven't yet said what Mises' reason is for taking the position he does. I'll get to that. But first I want to talk about another difference, because I think this will be relevant to explaining the first difference. A difference between Mises and Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school. Menger and Mises obviously agree on a lot of things, but they disagree on some things, and here's one of them. At the beginning of Principles of Economics, Menger sets out some of the criteria for what something has to fulfill in order to count as an economic good. And essentially he says that what you need is there has to exist a human need, there has to exist a causal relationship between the good and the need that it's satisfying. You have to know about the causal relationship, and you have to have command of the thing sufficient to direct it to that need. So, for example, why is water a good? Why is this stuff a good? Well, first there's a human need, thirst. That our need for water is a genuine human need. Second, there's a causal relationship between water and getting rid of that thirst. Water tends to make the thirst go away. Tends to fulfill the bodily needs that prompt thirst. Third, I know about it. Because, there could be this wonderful causal relationship. This water could be the thing to cure this weird condition of thirst I feel, but if I didn't know about it, if I didn't know that this would cure it, it wouldn't be an economic good. It wouldn't have economic value. And next, in order to have value, I have to be able to, it has to be usable. For example, suppose there's some water on the moon that'll cure my thirst, or that would if I could get to it. So I've got this genuine human need. There's that stuff that would fulfill it, and I know about the causal relationship, but I don't have command of that water on the moon to get it to me. Whereas this, everything comes together. Well, Menger relies on this notion of human needs, and although Menger never gives a complete, full analysis of exactly what he means by human needs, he seems to mean something more than just human wants. He seems to mean more than just whatever someone happens to feel like or desire. Because he thinks that there are cases where you can believe that something meets some need of yours and it doesn't. Sometimes that's because you can simply are mistaken about something being a means to an end. You can have a genuine need and think that something will fulfill it, but it won't. Like, suppose this were filled with salt water instead of fresh. And so I believe that that'll satisfy my thirst, but it really wouldn't. But Menger thinks there's another way things can go wrong, which is that you can, that the need itself may be imaginary. Menger thinks we have some imaginary needs, and thus the things we pursue to satisfy those needs are imaginary goods. We're just mistaken in thinking we need these things. Now, it's a pity that Menger doesn't say a little bit more about this so we can know exactly what kind of theory of needs he had in mind. He sometimes talks as if he had some kind of biological needs in mind. He gives example of cosmetics as an example of something that satisfies an imaginary need, he thinks. Well, anyway, Mises thought this was a disaster, this distinction between real and imaginary goods. And Mises thinks it's a disaster in two ways. First, he thinks it's irrelevant to economics. The market for goods will work equally well whether they're real or imaginary. In other words, if you think that a rabbit's foot doesn't genuinely bring luck, as long as people think it does, then there'll be demand for rabbit's feet, and then you can talk about the market for them and so forth. So as far as economics is concerned, it really doesn't, the analysis of how markets work doesn't really depend on people having correctly identified their needs. It just depends on, they're wanting things for whatever reason. So Mises thought the category of imaginary needs was irrelevant to economics. But Mises had a deeper criticism of it. He thought it wasn't just irrelevant to economics. He thought it was this mistaken period. It's not as though you say, well, no, that's not for economics, that's for philosophy or psychology or something. No. He thought that it just didn't make any sense to have this category of imaginary needs. He thought, well, really all we have is subjective values. People have these ends, and you can't evaluate the ends. Now, again, Mises certainly isn't the first person to think this. There's a long tradition in Western philosophy. There's a long debate between people who think that you can rationally evaluate ends and people who think you can only rationally evaluate means. So people like Hobbes and Hume, for example, seem to fall into the category of thinking, look, you can evaluate means as being efficient or inefficient to achieving ends, but there's nothing to say about the ends themselves. By contrast with, say, people like Plato and Aristotle, who are often thought to say that you can rationally evaluate ends. Now, that distinction can get a little tricky, and here's why. Whether you're evaluating a means or an end may depend on exactly what you mean by a means. And on the handout, right after I talk about Menger and Mises and imaginary goods, I mentioned the distinction between instrumental and constitutive means. An instrumental means is a means that's external to the end that it's serving. It's not part of the end. And a constitutive mean is one that's a part or a component of the end. So let me give you an example. Suppose that my goal is to play the Moonlight Sonata. And so, but, I need a piano and I need piano music, some sheet music, and I need some piano lessons. Until I have those three things, it ain't going to happen. So, I don't have a piano, I can't afford to buy a piano, I can't afford to buy the sheet music, and I can't afford to pay for the piano lessons, so I need to make some money. So, I get a job in order to make some money to get these things so I can then play the Moonlight Sonata. So you ask, why are you working this extra job? The answer is, I want to play the Moonlight Sonata. And this is a means to that. That would be an example of an instrumental means. It's an instrumental means because it's not part of the end. And the way you can tell that a means is not part of the end is that you can imagine having the end without the means, or it makes sense to wish for the end without the means. It makes sense to say, I wish I could play the Moonlight Sonata without having to work all these extra hours. A constitutive means is one that is part of the end. So, for example, suppose that I'm now, I earned my money, I bought the piano, I bought the sheet music, I have my piano lessons, I've learned to play the Moonlight Sonata, I've memorized it, I'm all ready, and now I'm sitting and I'm playing it. And at this moment I play a particular chord. And suppose you ask me, why did I play that chord? You say, you just like that chord? It's one of your favorite chords? Is that why you want to play it? Just for its own sake, because it's so pretty? And I'll say, no, I didn't play that chord just for its own sake. I played it because I want to play the Moonlight Sonata, and that chord occurs at that point in the Moonlight Sonata. So in order to play the Moonlight Sonata, I have to play that chord. So in effect, playing that chord is a means to the end of playing the Moonlight Sonata. But it's a very different kind of means from the way in which earning extra money was a means to playing the Moonlight Sonata. Because playing that chord is actually part of playing the Moonlight Sonata. It's not, the relationship isn't causal. It's not that playing this chord will somehow cause my playing the Moonlight Sonata to come into existence at some later point. Rather, it's just part of it. And the way you can tell when you've got a constitutive means is, it doesn't make sense to wish that you wish to have the end without the means. It makes sense to say, I wish I could play the Moonlight Sonata without having to earn all this extra money. It doesn't make sense to say, I wish I could play the Moonlight Sonata without having to play all these notes. Because the Moonlight Sonata just is those notes in that order. If you don't like those notes, you don't like the Moonlight Sonata. When people talk about means to end, they usually have in mind instrumental means. But once you have the category of constitutive means, then the distinction between evaluating means and evaluating ends might get a little fuzzier. Because when you're trying to determine what end you should pursue, sometimes it might just be that you've got some very generic end in mind, and you're trying to make it more specific. You're trying to figure out what the content of this end is. And you're deliberating and reasoning about that. In that case, are you rationally evaluating an end? Or you are trying to evaluate constitutive means to the end? People in the Aristotelian tradition make this distinction between instrumental and constitutive means. The people who deny that it's possible to rationally evaluate ends tend to think in terms of ends versus instrumental means and tend not to use this category of constitutive means. Now, Mises is famously a kind of utilitarian. Now, I've said that he believes in subjective value, not just explanatory but normative. And so it might sound surprising that someone who believes in that normative value is subjective, in other words, who thinks that there's no right or wrong values, would hold an ethical theory like utilitarianism, because utilitarianism is usually understood as a theory about which actions are right and why they're right. But it's important to understand that Mises means something a little bit different from by utilitarianism. By utilitarianism, he doesn't mean the view that human welfare is objectively good, and therefore the objectively right action is to produce as much of it as possible. That's not what Mises means by utilitarianism. Rather, by utilitarianism, he means essentially giving people advice as to how to achieve their ends. And although there's lots of variation among people's ends, Mises thinks that there's a lot in common. That because, given the conditions of human existence, there are certain intermediate ends that almost everyone is going to want in order to achieve their final ends. There are certain basic things like cooperation in society, absence of conflict, and so forth. Having your physical needs met, stuff like that. Stuff that some later philosophers would call basic goods. These are things that most of us are going to want, no matter what else we want, because they're sort of all-purpose means. To take an analogy of Hayek's, Hayek talks about things in this category. He says when you go when you go for a hike in the woods, you take a pocket knife. He says, I don't know if you do, but Hayek thinks you should. What specifically do you have in mind to use the pocket knife for? Well, it's good for it might be good for robbing people that you run across in the woods, but Hayek says you may not have any particular use in mind. It's just that a pocket knife is the kind of thing that's sort of generally useful for various kinds of situations that could come up. And so when you choose a pocket knife, to take with you, you're not choosing it for some specific purpose, but because it's useful for a whole bunch of different things you're going to want. And then Hayek is saying that laws should be like that. That laws shouldn't be designed to promote some particular goal, but should help people to achieve lots and lots of different goals. Well, Mises is making a similar point about the reason Mises thinks he can give advice, that you should have a free market is because free markets create the kinds of conditions of peace and non-conflict and material prosperity that are means to a wide variety of different ends that almost all of us hold. So whatever else we want, nearly all of us want material prosperity, we want freedom of choice, we want absence of conflict, etc. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that everyone wants this. And this indeed was one of the worries that Rothbard raises about Mises' approach, which is, well, there may be people who value something more than they value these general conditions of peace and prosperity. I mean, if you're Adolf Hitler, then the fact that your goals are going to endanger peace and prosperity may not be, a convincing argument to you, because if you're Adolf Hitler, there are things you care about more than peace and prosperity. And so Mises just may not have anything to say to Hitler. Maybe there's no way of dealing with Hitler except to shoot him. But most of us, Mises thought, the vast majority of people, our ends are such that we can best achieve them by general conditions of peace and prosperity that free markets bring about, and that's why. So that's the sense in which he's a utilitarian. He advocates free markets as a means to ends that almost everyone has and that he has too. But he doesn't claim that those ends are objectively valuable. He doesn't think he can tell Hitler, look, your ultimate goals are just, they just suck. They're wrong. He thinks there's nothing to say like that to Hitler. Either Hitler is mistakenly, inefficiently pursuing certain goals, and to some extent he may think that's true, particularly with economics. But if Hitler just wants, he wants conquest and domination and conflict, and he values those because he just thinks that they're ennobling, and this was a popular sentiment, alas, more widely than just with the Nazis. If that's what you think, then if you value those things for their own sake and not as a means to something further, well, then there's not much that we can tell you. So I think that explains why normative value subjectivism tends to support utilitarianism in Mises' mind. Why does he think that explanatory value subjectivism tends to support normative value subjectivism and thus utilitarianism? Well, there's a quote here from I put on the handout from Mises that I think sheds some light on this. So he says, it's the exact middle of the handout. All non-utilitarian systems of ethics look upon the moral law as something outside the nexus of means and ends. The moral code has no reference to human well-being and happiness, to expediency, and to the mundane striving after ends. It is heteronymous, more about that term in a minute, but he goes on to define it. That is, enjoined upon man by an agency that does not depend on human ideas and does not bother about human concerns. Heteronymous is the opposite of autonomous. Autonomous literally means giving the law to yourself. And heteronymous means having the law given to you by someone else. So nomos is law, hetero is other, auto is self. Now, there's a certain irony here in his using the term heteronymous, because the philosopher Immanuel Kant uses the terms autonomous and heteronymous to apply in a way almost exactly opposite of what Mises is using. And like the most common use of the word heteronymous is in connection with Kant's theory. So Mises is in effect taking a term associated with Kant and using it in a way that almost reverses its application. Kant thought that when you're following the dictates of pure reason, the categorical imperative, then you're truly acting freely and autonomously. Whereas when you follow your inclinations and desires, what you thought of as in some sense alien to or external to your reason, then you're acting heteronymously. Then you're sort of being driven around as the slave of your desires rather than acting autonomously on the basis of your own reason. Mises takes it the other way around. It's, if I give you advice as to how to achieve your desires, then I'm giving you advice that helps you be autonomous because I'm advising you to pursue your own goals that you've got. Whereas if I tell you should be pursuing something different from what you care about, then I'm enjoining upon you a heteronymous ethic. I'm saying, you should pursue something other than what you care about. So from his point of view, any moral advice that tells you to pursue ends different from the ones you have is going to be heteronymous. His objection to it is, and this is where the explanatory value subjectivism comes in, if people always act according to their own values, he thinks it just doesn't make sense to demand of people that they act for ends other than the ends they have. If I can show you a more efficient means of gaining some end you've already got, that's one thing. But if I just, try to tell you that you should pursue some end other than your end, if I try to give you an argument that appeals to some goal you don't have, then he thinks that that's just pointless. And obviously if since there's no way that you're going to pursue an end you don't have, because all action is aiming at some end or other, and you can only aim at ends you have, then the only way I can get you to aim at this end you don't have is to force you. And so that's why he thinks that non-utilitarian ethics are so dangerous. But once you see the difference between constitutive and instrumental ends, it means that can be a little more complicated, because it might turn out that what I'm trying to get you to do is to adopt a certain specification of your general end, trying to get you to see one particular thing as the best way of embodying your general end. And it's not so clear that falls counter to the same worries that that Mises has. It's not really clear that normative value subjectivism is what Mises really is arguing for, although I think he thought he was. He might just be arguing for something that's called ethical internalism, which is the view that you can't have any moral obligations unless those moral obligations somehow hook up with your motivations. So take this basic idea of ought implies can. It doesn't make any sense to say you ought to do something if it's something you can't do. I could tell you that you ought to flap your arms and fly to the moon right now. And that's pointless. Since you can't do it, it doesn't make any sense to say that you ought to do it. Well, likewise, you can't, given that all action involves aiming at ends, all voluntary purposeful action, we're not talking about, sneezes and reflexes and such, but all voluntary purposeful action involves aiming at some end or other. And if you don't have such an end, don't have such a goal, then it seems like you just can't aim at it. And so in that sense, it doesn't make sense to demand of you that you aim for some end you don't have. And so in that sense, all obligations have to somehow hook up with our motives. That's what ethical internalism says. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all motives are equally good. That it's consistent with a number of different views about what the relationship between obligations and motives might be. On some views, for example, the recognition of an obligation creates in you the motive. You recognize that something is good and that makes you want to do it when you didn't want to do it before. And so as a result, internalism is satisfied, but it's not subjective. Or you might think that there are some ends we can coherently make sense of to ourselves and some we can't. If you can convince someone that their conception of ends doesn't make sense, so they have to abandon it in favor of some other end. Now maybe they have some broader end here, like consistency or something like that. But if so, then you're just showing them how best to achieve the components of, or to satisfy what the components of consistency are going to be. And so a lot of ethical theorizing can be internalist without being subjective. Now, Leland Jaeger, who is an economist who's often spoken here at the Institute, has a book called Ethics as Social Science, which defends a kind of utilitarianism. I think it's very much Mises style kind of utilitarianism, in the sense that Jaeger is not arguing, unlike someone like John Stuart Mill, who thinks that human happiness is objectively good. It's a genuinely good thing, and more of it in the universe is better, and that's why you should be a utilitarian. Jaeger doesn't. Jaeger thinks, unlike Mill, Jaeger thinks all ends are arbitrary. All ultimate ends are arbitrary. Mill doesn't. Mill thinks that there's a problem with, it's difficult to prove something's value as an arbitrary end, but Mill still thinks it can be reasonable to accept something as an ultimate end in a way that doesn't make it arbitrary. Jaeger thinks it is, but he thinks there's an advantage to utilitarianism because utilitarianism minimizes the amount of arbitrariness in our system. You just have one value, human welfare. Whereas if you're not a utilitarian, you've got a whole bunch of things, because you probably still care about human welfare. But you also care about rights, and respecting people's rights, even when that conflicts with human welfare. And you probably have something like you believe in keeping promises and all kinds of crap like that. I mean, you believe in a whole bunch of different values, all potentially competing values. And so these are a whole bunch of ultimate ends. And since ultimate ends are arbitrary, Jaeger says if you believe in a bunch of different things that have inherent value, then you've increased the amount of arbitrariness in your system, because you've got lots and lots of arbitrary ends instead of just one. So he thinks the advantage of utilitarianism is that you have just one end, plus that one end is not very controversial. Everyone thinks human happiness is cool. Well, Carlyle didn't, but most of us think it's pretty cool. But I think there's some grounds for worrying about that. First of all, it's not clear that if your whole system rests on arbitrary values, I'm not sure that having it rest on fewer as opposed to more of them necessarily makes your theory, changes how arbitrary your theory is. If I've got an argument and some of the premises are just arbitrary, does my argument become more arbitrary as more of the premises? I mean, if I just got one premise, but everything rests on it, and it's arbitrary, I think that maybe that's already a problem. So I'm not sure why this concern would really favor utilitarianism over other approaches. And if it's fairly uncontroversial that human happiness matters, it may be true, but it's also lots of people, think that things other than merely promoting or maximizing human welfare matter. Then we disagree about which things. There's a lot more disagreement about that. But there's a lot of agreement that, some things besides maximizing utility matter. So the mere uncontroversialness of it is not so clear that it works either. But is it really true that ultimate ends are arbitrary? A lot of philosophers use this concept of what's sometimes called reflective equilibrium, but I prefer the term reflective equilibration for sort of Austrian reasons that I don't have time to get into, but you can ask about that if you want. Basically, this is the idea that as you balance your ideas against each other, trace out their implications, try to eliminate conflicts. If you find two of your beliefs conflicting, you get rid of the one that you're least committed to, and so on. I think that the output of that result is not necessarily arbitrary. And I think a good analogy is with a crossword puzzle. So the crossword puzzle, as you go ahead filling it out, initially there are a whole bunch of cases where you don't know what answer to give. Either nothing occurs to you, or several things occur to you, all equally good. And so at that point, if you just picked an answer, it would be arbitrary. But the need to make your answers fit in with the other answers gradually reduces the level of arbitrariness. I think something like that can be true in ethics as well. And I have a review of Jaeger's book. I don't have it linked to on the sheet, but some of the things that are linked to on the sheet also link to it. So it's indirectly linked to from this sheet. There's, I think, an interesting connection between praxeology and, in particular, sort of the classical eudaimonist tradition in ethics, which basically runs through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the medieval scholastics like Augustine and Aquinas. People debate whether Augustine counts as a scholastic or not, but that really doesn't matter for present purposes. One of the connections is that there's a considerable extent to which free market economics grows out of this tradition. There are a number of books out there for sale in the bookstore about the relationship between free market economics and late medieval, early Renaissance scholasticism. And the reasons for this, Aristotelian style and Socratic style ethics, puts a lot of focus on analyzing action and analyzing the concepts of means and ends and how you apply means to ends and so forth. And so they were doing this primarily with ethical goals in mind. But a lot of that analysis turns out to be very useful to economics. And so I think it's no surprise that things like the School of Salamanca developed so many anticipations of free market economics. And the whole idea that, of one sense of subjective value, that means get their value from the end. So what makes the end valuable is not that you put a lot of really costly means into it, so that this piece of this glommed together glop of cardboard and clay that I came up with is really, really valuable because I spent 30 hours making it. It's not the value of the means that determines the value of the end, but the other way around. That it's the end that determines the value of the means, and the end is more valuable than the means. These are all principles of Austrian economics, but those principles first appear in sort of classical Greek and Roman and medieval ethics. So I think it's no coincidence that early praxeological ideas in economics grow out of what was basically a praxeological ethical tradition. Now, this eudaimonist tradition was not subjectivist in the normative sense. It thought that there was something definitely to be said about right and wrong ends. What this tradition held was that for each of us has an overall ultimate end, which the Greeks called eudaimonia, which is usually translated as happiness, and that's a little bit misleading nowadays because we tend to think of happiness as something like a subjective mental state, and that's not all they meant. They meant something like an objective state of living well, of being a success at being a human being. That might be the best way of putting the term. Being a flourishing human being. One of the advantages of translating it as happiness is that we've got a useful adjective, happy. Well, I guess flourishing can be both a noun and an adjective. It still sounds a little bit more awkward. And being a success at being a human being, it's awkward to use that as an adjective each time. So that's probably why we've kept the term happiness. The term happiness originally didn't have as subjective connotations as it does now. So they thought that we each have an ultimate good, an ultimate end, and that what's good for us to choose is the things that are constituents of our ultimate end. And we can get those wrong, we can be mistaken about what the constituents are, but there's an objective matter of fact as to what they are, then we can figure out. And once we recognize something as a constituent of our ultimate end, we will be motivated to care about it. Now, why did they think that? Why not just think we've got a whole bunch of different ultimate ends? Why do they think that for each of us there has to be one overall one? Well, here's one of the arguments they gave. Suppose the contrary. Suppose you just had a bunch of individual ends and no story about how to fit them together. Just a bunch of things you happen to want. Well, what happens if there's a conflict between them? So for example, let's make it simple. Suppose I have only two goals in life. Fame and ice cream. The only two things I care about, nothing else. But they don't fit together into any larger overall goal. I have no story about one being more important than the other. These are just the two things I care about. Well, sometimes the best way to achieve one of these will be the best way to achieve the other. Like, entering an ice cream eating contest could bring me both fame and ice cream. But there are going to be lots of cases where the best way to achieve one is going to be different from the best way to achieve the other one. So I'm going to have to do a trade-off. I'm going to have to deliberate about, in this particular case, should I go for the ice cream or the fame? Or how much ice cream should I choose now as opposed to how much fame? Well, when I'm doing that, when I'm deliberating, that's a purposeful activity. So it's got to have some end. It's got to be aiming at some end. What end is it aiming at? If my only ends are fame and ice cream, what is this process of deliberation, doing the trade-offs, aiming at? Can't be aiming at fame, because if that were the aim, I wouldn't have to puzzle about it. Just go for the fame. For the same reason it can't be the ice cream. It's got to be something more overall. It's got to be something like, what I'm aiming at is, the most defensible way of reconciling each of these goods and getting as much of them as possible in some weighted way or something like that. Some story about how these ends fit into the overall shape of my life. So that's why the Greeks thought that each of us has an ultimate end. They also thought that this ultimate end was not just a psychological state. It wasn't just pleasure. Now it's hard to know exactly what Mises thinks about this. Mises often talks about all action as being motivated by relieving felt uneasiness. Sometimes it seems like he means this in a psychological way, that you've actually got this kind of icky feeling and you want to make it go away. And so in that sense, all action would have some kind of psychological state of yourself as its end. At other times, it sounds like he means it in a purely formal way, just meaning, getting what you prefer, giving up what you prefer less to get what you prefer more. Whichever way Mises means it, certainly a lot of people have taken it in a kind of subjective psychological way, to think everything we do is aimed at either achieving some positive psychological state of felt satisfaction or of relieving some kind of felt dissatisfaction or something like that. By and large, the Greeks didn't think this either. Some of them did. Epicurus did, although Epicurus' version of pleasure is sort of oddball, so I won't get into it. But a lot of these thinkers thought that that wasn't right. Aristotle, for example, thought that what happens after our death matters to us. And he wasn't talking about the afterlife. He meant, he didn't believe in a personal afterlife. He just meant, what happens to your friends and family and so on after you're dead. So take the standard argument people often give to try and convince you that we care about things other than just our subjective psychological satisfaction. Why do you buy life insurance? That's an action. Must have an end. What's the end? Well, you might think the end is, to make sure, the end is that your loved ones will do well after you're dead. But of course, that's not going to cause you pleasure because you won't be around to experience it. Now you could say, well, yeah, but you get pleasure now from the thought that you've bought life insurance, and thus from the thought that your loved ones will do well after you're dead. That's true. But the question is your reason for buying life insurance solely that it causes this pleasant thought that your loved ones will do well? That might be part of, might be one of the benefits of it. But is that the sole benefit? Here's reason to think not. Suppose I make you the following deal. I can sell you a life insurance policy for $100, or instead I can give you a magic pill for $50. The magic pill will make you believe you've bought life insurance. So, in both cases, the subjective result will be the same. In both cases, you will have this pleasant feeling that you've bought life insurance and that therefore your loved ones are protected after you're dead. The difference between them is that the pill's cheaper. If your only reason for buying life insurance is you want to have this, this happy feeling, then you'd have no reason not to have the pill. Maybe you'd worry about, the few seconds of guilt you feel between buying the pill and eating it. But if you're worried about that, I can fix the example. I won't do it now, but if someone really worries about that, I can fix that. I can take care of that too. But it seems as though most people would prefer to buy prefer to pay the $100 for the real life insurance as opposed to the $50 for the feel-good thinking that you've bought life insurance. And even if you're sure that you're never going to find out, et cetera, et cetera. And that suggests we do care about things other than just our psychological satisfactions. We care about how things really are. Now, on the handout here, I also have some stuff about what the relationship is between rights and utilitarianism, but since I'd rather get into questions, and of course that can be one of your questions if you want, I'm going to stop short of that. I have a link here to a previous version of this lecture where I didn't stop short. I must have talked faster, and did get into that. But I think I'd rather just open up to questions now. So, questions now. Yes?
I understand your distinction between instrumental and constitutive means, but I just wonder, could you clarify the relationship of that to imaginary goods? I didn't get why you brought it up in that context. Okay,
so the question is, what's the relationship between the distinction between constitutive and instrumental means on the one hand, and the distinction between real and imaginary goods on the other? Well, here's the difference. Here's how I took it to be relevant. Menger thinks here's a way of putting Menger's point. Menger thinks not only can you make a mistake about whether your means will achieve your ends, you can also make a mistake about whether your ends are any good. Mises thinks you can't make mistakes about your ends. Those are just arbitrary. The only mistakes you can make is to whether your means will be a good way of achieving them or not. Not a morally good way, just an effective way of achieving them. What I'm suggesting is that distinction can be blurred a bit once you recognize that one of the things we can debate about is not just whether we've got the right instrumental means to our ends, but whether we've got the right constitutive means. In other words, whether we've got this general end we've actually specified correctly in a particular case. Now, suppose two people are debating with each other about whether certain something is a genuine constitutive means to some end they both share. Is one of them, each of them is accusing the other of making a mistake. Is that a mistake about means or a mistake about ends? Well, a mistake about constitutive means is a mistake about what the end looks like. It's a mistake about sort of the internal structure of the end. It's not a mistake about whether to have that end or not. And so I was just suggesting that the distinction between saying you can only make a mistake about means and saying no, you can also make a mistake about ends, exactly what that means gets more complicated once you introduce the idea of constitutive means. Yes?
I think that's the next thing on the page, but I'm quite interested about you often have natural rights theorists who also believe in the consequential arguments, and then people say, you're a hidden consequentialist, and then yet consequentialists who say, but would you kill someone if it maximizes utility? Of course not. Also, you're a hidden natural rights theorist. So I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between those two.
Okay, so the question is about the relationship between consequentialism, the view that, in effect, that the reason to respect rights is because the general policy of doing so has positive effects on human welfare, versus the natural rights view, or the more usual natural rights view, that there's some inherent value to respecting rights. And what the question also brought up is, each side in that dispute sometimes accuses the other side of hypocrisy, because the consequentialists will say, look, you natural rights theorists say that your reasons, let's put it in a libertarian context, consequentialist libertarians say to natural rights libertarians, you claim your reason for favoring the free market is because of this inherent value of rights, and that but of course that commits you to saying that you would care about and favor these rights even if they had horrible economic consequences. But in fact, even people who say that the consequences are not their reason, you never find people saying, I think libertarianism would have horrible economic consequences. It would, cause social disorder. It would make the poor people worse off. It would wreck the environment. But I still think we should respect these rights just because they're inherently moral. You don't find that very often. I won't say you never find it. I'm sure there's someone who's held that position. For almost anything, there's someone who's held it. But by and large, people who claim that their reasons for favoring rights are inherent rather than instrumental, nevertheless, always seem to think that the instrumental argument works, and so they're accused of being somehow hidden utilitarians. But of course, the argument works the other way too, in that, I think if you're a consistent consequentialist, you'd be willing to do all kinds of apparently morally horrific things to produce good consequences, like killing one healthy patient in order to redistribute their organs to save 5 other patients or something like that. And consequentialists are almost always at pains to try to show that they're not committed to that. There's some kind of indirect argument that, even if it seems like you could produce more utility in the short run by doing this, a general policy of violating rights would have worse results in the long run, blah, blah, blah. So that utilitarians always try to show that, that the best way to get utilitarian results is really to act as though you believe in natural rights. And so each side suspects the other of hypocrisy. Now, I think another possibility is that, as I've said, I'm sort of a fan of this ancient Greek approach to ethics, and one feature of that approach is what's sometimes called the unity of virtue. Now, that's usually defined as the view that you can't have one virtue without having them all, but I think that's sort of picking it up by one of the consequences of the theory and not what's most interesting about it, which I think is the view that the content of each virtue is partly determined by the content of the other virtues. So take in particular, let's have a simplified virtue theory, just 3 virtues: prudence, benevolence, and justice. Well, prudence is the virtue that's concerned with getting good consequences for yourself. And benevolence is concerned with getting good consequences for other people, and justice is concerned with respecting people's rights. I think that's a horribly oversimplified view of those virtues, but just, this is a, little toy example. If you hold the unity of virtue, what you think is that some concern, prudence and benevolence will play a role in determining the content of justice, so that concern for consequences will play a role in determining what our rights are. This won't be the sole role, but it'll be a partial role. But it works the other way around too. I think that concerns with justice play a role in determining what counts as a good or bad consequence. I don't want to go too long about that, because that's a whole lecture in itself. But anyway, that's sort of my short answer. Is I think that consequential considerations play a role in determining the content of justice, but not an exclusive role, and it works the other way around too. Yes.
For your insurance example, if a person was faced with the choice to be hooked up to a machine when they would be put into a psychological state of tremendous euphoria for however long it would be that they were attached to this machine, would they, because they desire something more genuine and not just a psychological feeling, would they have the motivation to remove themselves from this machine?
Well, this is an example that Robert Nozick gives called the experience machine. He gives in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and it's probably the thing the one thing in Nozick that's the most popular in mainstream academic philosophy. You may not like his politics, but this particular example is very popular. So what Nozick is arguing is that if all you care about is how your experiences feel from the inside, then you'd have no reason not to plug yourself into a machine that would give you lots of pleasant experiences, even if in real life you're not achieving anything and all your friends are dying and you're just lying there in a lump or something. But you'd have all these wonderful experiences. So if all you really care about is how your experiences feel from the inside, you'd have no reason not to plug yourself in. If you're not eager to plug yourself in, that shows you care about something more. Or even if you hesitate. I mean, he just says, he puts it very straightforwardly. He says, you wouldn't plug in, and that shows you care about something more. But we can make it a little more nuanced and say, even if you might decide to plug in, if you're reluctant at all, if you see some kind of cost benefit there, that shows that at least you do care about something other than just how things feel from the inside. Now, of course, it's true that once you've been on it for a while, you might get kind of addicted to it. And so if you pull you out of it and ask you, now do you want to go back in? You might say yes, but that's just, but being addicted to something may not be quite the same thing as, making a sincere judgment that that's what you most want. I mean, you may not want to become addicted to drugs either, but once you are addicted, then you're not going to want to quit. Any others? Okay. Last one, I think.
I want to go back to the ultimate good argument from the old Greeks. Aren't they making something like the water-diamond fallacy, in like the two ends and when they have to choose? Like you said something like, you need an ultimate good because when the only goods you want to achieve conflict, you need something above that to choose. But isn't that similar to the water-diamond fallacy?
So the question is whether the ultimate good argument that I'm referring to here is making a mistake similar to the water-diamond fallacy. I don't think so. I think that it's because they're granting that they would grant. In fact, they said the things like that you're not going to choose diamonds over water in every case. Which one is more valuable depends on the circumstances. But nevertheless, when you are trying to make that determination of which one's more valuable, that action itself is a goal-directed action. So the question is, what is the goal you have? So if you assume that all you care about is water and diamonds and nothing else, but when you're trying to decide how much water to give up to get diamonds or vice versa, that action has to have some kind of overarching thing. Even if you just want to call it, they would think that it's something, some reason to call it more than just overall utility. But still, even just that, you have to care about your overall utility and not just about water and diamonds in order to purposefully make a choice between them. Otherwise, you just sort of randomly grab it, whichever one was closer or something like that. Okay.